Welcome to the webinar, Navigating the Global Agri-Food Policy Shift, Understanding the Forces Shaping Future Innovation. My name is Josh Haslen. I'm the Senior Research Director here at Lux Research, and I'm going to be moderating today's session. But more importantly, presenting today are my colleagues Harini Venkatraman, Associate Research Director, and Matilda Del Fontana, Analyst here at Lux Research. Now, throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the question box on the screen. And of course, time permitting, we'll answer any and all questions that we can. But if your question doesn't get answered, don't worry. We're going to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. Now, if at any point you experience technical difficulties, a frozen screen, the best way to overcome this is to simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. With that, let's jump right into the discussion.
Thank you so much, Josh, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Today, we are here to discuss how policy and regulation are reshaping the agri-food innovation landscape. Across industry, the criteria for market success are shifting. Performance, cost, and scalability are no longer sufficient on their own. We are seeing regulatory direction increasingly determining which technologies succeed and which stall. And if we look back at the past decades, we can see several examples of that. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with expanded polyestyrene, or EPS. For decades, it was considered a highly efficient packaging material because it was lightweight, cheap, largely viable. And companies really built a whole business around it. And dark container became one of the leaders in the market. The system really worked until the policy framing shifted. In the early 2010s, New York introduced a city ban on EPS. California, for example, followed suit with statewide restriction. But then it was when the EU introduced the Single-Use Plastic Directive that EPS became a regulatory target. So players like DART responded defensively. They invested in lobbying litigation, which delayed some of the bans, but ultimately did not change the policy direction. As a result, DART lost major client that in the meantime has shifted towards more compliant materials, and it had to shut down several EPS facilities. But these dynamics are not just limited to the packaging sector, right? If you look at the food industry, for example, for decades, titanium dioxide was commonly used as whitening agent in different food formulation. And this because, again, it was inexpensive, it provided the opacity and visual consistent, and were performing reliable. So many food products were really designed around it. And again, the system worked really well until the regulatory framing shifted. Because in 2021, the European Food Safety Authority concluded that titanium dioxide was no longer considered safe as food additives due to genotoxicity concern, and the EU moved to ban its use. So companies that were heavily dependent on titanium dioxide had to reformulate quickly and build a whole new supply chain and product strategy. On the other hand, the competitors that had previously invested in alternative whitening system moved more quickly in the transition. So if you think about that, right, both examples tell a clear story. And that is that technical superiority does not guarantee long-term viability when the regulatory criteria change. In both cases, the base of the competition shifted from pure performance to circularity and health risk management. So overall, it's clear that when those criteria for competition shift, innovation that ignore policy trajectory becomes a capital risk. So for innovation leaders here, the key question is not whether regulation matters. The key question is how to anticipate where policy will accelerate innovation, where it will constrain it, and where it will redefine that advantage all together.
Thank you so much, Matilda. And today what we're going to be doing is use our Lux's Agri-Food Policy Compass to show where regulation is shaping innovation. When you think about regulation, they can both enable but also create constraints. So we'll be looking at both. We'll also look at a few policy signals which are influencing technology adoption and what do they mean for how innovation is carried out and which areas should you prioritize as an innovation team and strategies going forward. Now, first up, let's take a look at a little bit at the background of the policy compass in itself. Now, if you think about Lux's Agri-Food Policy Compass, it's actually a framework that we have developed to help companies across the value chain, right? It could be an agriculture company, ingredient company. It could also be like downstream, a B2C food producer or beverage developer. So all of these companies, you need to interpret how policy environments are shifting and how does that affect technology and innovation decisions. So the framework here evaluates policy in two dimensions. The first one that you see here on the vertical axis is the business impact. And the business impact really looks at how strongly each of these policies can actually impact across the value chain, starting from inputs, right? Inputs is an important part, then the process in itself, going all the way to production of final products and the partnerships that are necessary to enable producing them. But importantly, we're also taking into account the broader supply side effects. And this is very important for agri-food companies, as you may all know. It's not just about producing and formulating, also about getting it to the market at the right time. Now, the second dimension, which we're looking at across the horizontal axis that you see here, is the policy likelihood. Now, what's the policy likelihood looking at is actually how easy or how feasible is a policy to move from concept all the way to implementation, right? There are multiple factors we take into account here again, the current regulatory status. We're also looking at the level of governmental backing, specifically for global policies. We'll see that there are regional differences, and that's an important factor to consider. And also the degree of political volatility and how that impacts whether these policies could be accelerated or delayed in terms of adoption. Now, by combining these two dimensions that you see here, what we really end up having is this policy compass that helps you understand not just policy that matters, right? As Matilda brought up, that's an important aspect, but more importantly, how soon and how significantly some of these policies can shift the regional innovation trajectories. So instead of viewing, the policy compass in itself as a risk assessment tool, what's important to know is it can also be used to understand strongly which regulations are going to shape up the landscape of innovation, and which is why we've kind of divided this into 4 different quadrants. Starting from the top left, what you can see here is we have the evolving quadrant, which actually indicates the policy momentum is building. However, the regulations in itself, they're not completely defined, right? So you need to still stay very close to developments. And in fact, in some cases, you have to position yourselves early to be able to look at some of these policies in this quadrant. On the bottom left here, you can see the minimal policy environments, right? And that is really about policies and regulations which have limited immediate impact. Now, in these areas, companies don't have to go out of the way to innovate. However, it's important that some of these minimal ones can gradually also go into the other quadrant, right? So you have to still monitor these developments, but you don't have to really go the harder way to innovate here. Now, moving to manageable policy quadrant, which you can see here, the policy influence is pretty high, right, because of the business impact. However, the idea about like how predictable they are, that are relatively predictable. A lot of the policies that happen across the agri-food value chain, and you'll see that in some of the examples that we bring, would actually be in that kind of a manageable quadrant to help understand how some areas are developing quite well in terms of predictability, but the business impact can change. And we'll bring some examples to illustrate that. And finally, the disruptive policy environment is one where you can see that the regulations can significantly reshape, creating both major risks, but also opportunities for companies to adapt very quickly. Now, having presented this policy compass, you may wonder how actually to put this policy compass into practice. You can think about using this compass as a guide for answering 3 strategic questions. Now, the first one is really about how do I go about avoiding risk in my innovation strategy? I already mentioned that the compass kind of helps you identify potential barriers, but also the whole predictive nature for some of those policies that are not yet fully enacted, right? I think those are the ones which you want to be preparing ahead of time. So it's really about the policy risk piece. And then the second aspect is about how do you actually capture innovations which are policy driven? Any type of opportunities that arise because of policies, again, they are not going to be just constraining innovation, but they're also going to create new markets, whether it's demand for certain type of technologies or regionally different opportunities. So how do you actually capture these opportunities? I think that's the second question. And the third one is really around how does the policy change the regionality element that I brought up before? So who do you prioritize if you want to work for a particular area? And if you want to bring those technologies to market, how do you have to take a different approach, whether it's EMEA versus APAC or the Americas, right? So ultimately, the policy compass will help you to align that innovation strategy with the policy landscape for any of these different areas we're going to talk about today. All right. I think with that, what we're going to do in the next section is just jump right into taking some of our themes that we've identified and then introduce the policy compass and apply it to be able to understand the key policy trajectories and the technology adoption in agri-food. Very quickly, just wanted to point out that we have at Lux identified 6 key innovation priorities, which are shaping up the future of the food and the beverage industry. We have actually sorted them in terms of like the highest client priority, right? We are talking about enhancing health outcomes, which is one of the first things that come into mind, and then going all the way to supply chain resilience, enabling growth through the bioeconomy, advancing purposeful innovation that is human-centric, connected to consumers, and then of course packaging, impactful packaging, functional and performance-oriented packaging. Now, all of these areas have a commonality, right? This is where I think the policy and regulation is a common thread across all of these 5 other priorities. So as an important point here, it's really the fact that policy is pervasive, the impact of policy is pervasive, and you can see that across all of these priorities. So today, for the sake of time, what we'll do is we'll be focusing on 3 of the pillars here. Again, we are going to start with health. We're going to go a little bit into resilience and finish up with packaging. Health is an important one because, as you have seen, a lot of the impetus now currently in the market, whether you're seeing the big Unilever acquisition versus any of the other 2026 moves that we are seeing in the market, those are all health and nutrition related now. So keeping that in mind, we're going to kickstart applying this policy compass to enhanced health and reduce harm priority. Now, if you look at the regionality here, right, enhanced health priorities are emerging across all of the regions. It's not only, in one region and not in the other, right? It's an important area that every country is actually looking at these policies. However, the speed and the scope of these approaches are differing significantly. If you look at North America, especially in the US, what you're seeing is there is an increasing scrutiny for ingredients, ultra-processed foods, but also there's a lot of discussions around the whole additive ban, synthetic dye ban, and coupling that with the potential of evolving front-of-pack labeling. Now, Europe, on the other hand, has already done some of this, right? As Matilda pointed out, titanium dioxide was banned, and there were also other additives and colors which were banned already in the European Union. Now, what Europe is now doing is more a systematic nutritional signaling, right? How can I harmonize front-of-pack pack labeling, as well as some of the other impactful regulations like the high fat, sugar in the UK, which could potentially influence formulation and marketing. Now, in Latin America, and this is a big market for food and nutrition overall, countries like Brazil are actually looking a little bit stronger in terms of pushing warning labels and regulations on ultra-processed food. In fact, Brazil's been one of the pioneers in being able to coin this whole ultra-processed food definition, although it is pretty fragmented across different countries, I would say, in terms of what does it actually mean. Now, in Asia, the policy momentum is a little bit different due to the nature of different types of countries within Asia, right? Some developing, some developed. I think what we're seeing is the beginning of a new type of need for harmonized policies here. So we're seeing some of these measures like sugar reduction, whether it's about taxes in China or the Nutrigate labeling in Singapore. We're seeing all of this grow, but at a moderate pace. But taken together, what we see is that the global shift is really pushing consumers to make healthier choices. But that's only possible if some of these companies are reformulating and rethinking their product portfolios. You take all of these policies that I mentioned, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but gives you a really good representation of what's happening across the different regions, and plot that across our policy compass. And you'll be able to see that a lot of the policies are in that evolving to the disruptive zone, because some of these are very important to notice, like the EU harmonized front-of-pack labeling and also the proposed US dye ban. I think these could significantly influence ingredient choices and how you formulate. But in the manageable quadrant, I already mentioned some of the ones like the HFSS in the UK or the Singapore's Nutrigate labeling. They're still shaping the market behavior, and they're pushing companies towards reformulation, but they're also manageable at the same time, in the sense that these are predictable. People knew that these policies are going to come to fruition, and you have to actually start working on them way before. Meanwhile, in Asia, I think we definitely see that there's a gradual regulatory trajectory. But one thing that really pops here is that Asia being that important region for you to consider, the policy is going to be playing a far more important role in the future in terms of how you want to reformulate your product portfolios there. Now, as an example, I'm just going to bring up an innovation here, especially the one that addresses the current need, the need for reformulation, but also especially in the Europe, as the policy for front-of-pack package labeling is kind of evolving. We're seeing that there's a lot more challenge in terms of maintaining cost, the clean label requirements, but also the taste element. And a lot of the reformulation efforts now, although some of them are digitally enabled, I don't think really was able to bring these efforts into fruition. So you'll see that the newer set of startups that we are beginning to see in this landscape, like the AKA Foods in the Netherlands, they just raised about $17 million to be able to develop a centralized R&D platform, right? Again, this is really targeting also like the R&D audience in big companies, SMEs and all that, food and beverage developers. And what they're trying to do is really bring in different data sets, right? Ingredient specifications, sensory feedback, or even like the regulatory constraints. This is often not really taken into account. And I think it's going to be important for teams to be able to predict, than just waiting at the end of the day to say if this ingredient would actually be, even if it works very well in a formulation, will it actually be regulatory ready? So these platforms can actually identify ingredient substitutions. I think some of the use cases can go into sugar reduction, or even like going into newer ones, right? For example, if you're looking at reduced fat alternatives while maintaining the functionality and the performance. Again, the the rigor and the need to test this is still there because it's a relatively new platform and they're just running pilots with a lot of companies. But it's a good indication in terms of the gap, right? The gap being there is a need to streamline data-driven R&D and combining sensory with regulatory and all of this. And I think Agrifood's platform is trying to address that. All right. I'm going to quickly jump to the next pillar that I wanted to talk about today, resilience building. And resilience building is a very important one. And as I mentioned, for the agri-food ecosystem to be able to move the inputs all the way to finished products, I think resilience building is an important priority, what we are looking at and what clients are asking us. So across regions for resilience building, we've seen that governments are introducing policies that aim to really address food security, improving agricultural productivity. However, some of them are also looking at preventing harmful ingredients, and they can come in different forms, whether it's pesticides or going all the way into PFAS-related and newer bans. Now, in North America, we've seen that there are programs like the U.S. Farm Bill, which has been extended for a third time. And again, parts of it are like now being covered by like the One Big Beautiful Bill. But I think it's still an interesting one to take into consideration because of the ability to address, some of these resilient production systems. Again, a lot of this is still covering, farmers and crop insurance and all of that, but there's still an element of innovation that is still left in there. Europe is different, right? They've always been working a lot in terms of strengthening agricultural inputs and farming practices that would align with the development of some of the regulations. Now, EUDR is a good example for the sourcing side. But if you look at more on the upstream side, you also see that EU's proposed new genomic techniques framework, I think a long pending one. So I'm pretty excited to see as it comes to the final bits of being able to turn that into a law. Soil health initiative is another example. Now, Latin America, Asia, I think we're seeing a lot more interest around productivity, modernization, but also the whole idea about bioeconomy and localized production, right? I think that's whether it's about like introducing pilot programs, like I think China has been doing a lot of that in terms of introducing pilots for the bioeconomy, and they're going to target a lot of food additives. Again, that's within a lot of other types of ingredients, but this goes on to show that, what can you do to be able to strengthen and build a resilient supply chain there. Now, if you map these policies across the policy compass that I just brought up, you'll be able to see that some of those are in the evolving space, like the U.S. Farm Bill, China's bioeconomy. Those are like really important ones to consider. But the disruptive quadrant is what is maybe of the most interest, right? Because the nature of which these policies are moving, the time that it's taken to move some of them, especially the NGT is a good example. When these policies are actually, put into action, you'll see that there will be a sudden burst of like innovation coming in. We're already seeing those weak signals. Look at gene editing. I think just in the past 3 months, we've seen quite a bit of that activity and startups actually able to raise money. And they were originally focusing on other markets, and now they're trying to come back to the Europe. So it's a really good sign to be able to think about how policies could reshape some of the technology adoption too. There are incentives in Brazil, right, like the Plano Safra or the Singapore 2030. They're all in the manageable category because they are supporting domestic innovation and production. So they're creating both some of those new opportunities for technologies. Now, a good example is you just take what's needed for the next step, right? Here in Europe, if you think about the EU NGT progressing pretty fast, I think the gene editing platform that some of the companies are creating, Resurrect Bio is a good example, and they are actually moving towards, building, I'd say like a accelerated trade discovery and development platform. Just as we saw in the food formulation side, there was a need, there was a gap for like more unified data sources. We're beginning to see that from the agriculture side as well. While there are plenty of these type of like trade discovery platforms, the ones which are targeting unique use cases will probably be able to position them better with the EU NGT, and they're also like specific to the needs of European Union. First, Corteva Ventures is actually participating in one of the funding rounds for Restrict Bio, but I would imagine that could easily be applicable to other regions as well as they kind of like expand and scale some of their gene editing platforms. And again, what is important to look for is really how they could advance about 18 different disease-resistant traits. So that's another important point here to consider. With that, I think we took a look at the health, resilience building, and I'll pass it back to my colleague Matilda to talk a bit about impactful packaging-related policies.
Thank you so much, Rini. And yeah, we are now here to talk about our last priorities, right? Impactful packaging. And before we're doing that, I just want to mention quickly that when we think about impactful packaging, the global policy landscape is moving toward one defined objective, and that is improving how packaging waste is managed. That means that governments are not anymore prioritizing absolute plastic reduction, but instead they are prioritizing the economics of waste management. But at the same time, while this direction is common, we can see still fragmentation in how governments are implementing policy across the globe. Again, as for the other priorities in this slide, you can see the distribution of some of the packaging policies and how they are spread globally. So going left to right, in North America, we can see that the space is still quite fragmented. The US does not have in this moment any federal level packaging policy, but we are seeing the establishing of state level regulation like the California SB 54 that are increasingly influencing national corporate strategy. South America has also like a spread of policy that is uneven, but Brazil, for example, has established a national solid waste law, and we're seeing some other country like Chile trying to address the plastic waste management problem. EU instead has the most integrated regulatory environment to date, because the region combines single-use plastic directive, EPR schemes, and chemical controls over substance of concern within a coordinated framework that is the REACH. And we're seeing the UK really following a similar approach. If you move to APAC instead, we are seeing a few countries like Indonesia or Australia expanding EPR schemes and recycled content requirement, while others emphasize the role of biodegradable material and link that to broader bioeconomy strategy. And then you see countries like Japan that are scrutinizing a substance of concern like per and polyfluoroalkyl substance or PFAS. So this regional difference ultimately define which technology will succeed. So geography is an important angle, but when you translate that into strategic decision, this is where the policy compass become critical. So here you can see those policy we were just like mentioning mapped out on the compass. And if you look at distribution of the policy on the compass, there are a few takeaways we can observe, right? First of all, policy have high likelihood across the board. Because compared to 5 years ago, packaging regulation has really moved toward more defined direction, and it has become a priority for most government. But interestingly enough, the type of policy has also evolved. So we move from isolated bans like the one on EPS toward more complex and integrated policy. That could be extended producer responsibility scheme, recyclability mandate and recycled content requirement, and packaging design criteria altogether. But luckily, all of this policy, most of them sit in the manageable quadrant of the compass, and that means that they will all require for sure adjustment to the packaging material and design, but would not disrupt completely the value chain through which the packaging industry is operating. But there are like a few that sit in the disruptive quadrant, and one of them being the packaging and packaging waste regulation, that I'm sure most of you might know is already a reality because it entered in force in Europe in February 2025, and most provisions are set to start in August 2026. So what is interesting and why the PPWR is so disruptive is that it's the first framework that combines under one single policy stricter definition of recyclability, recycled content mandate, reuse targets, and EPR scheme, together with control over substance of concern. So the PPWR really does more than introducing a new requirement. It really redefines that market access. And in the current landscape, that market access is defined by recyclability and access to compliant recycled content. So companies operating in the space really need to secure that recycled content in order to maintain a competitive edge and long-term viability on the market. And one company that offer, in my opinion, a really good example of proactive positioning under this point of view is Procter & Gamble. So we are all familiar with P&G. They are not a waste operator. P&G is a brand focused on product formulation, but the company recognized that a reliable access to that high quality recycled material was becoming a risk. So rather than competing downstream, the company moved upstream. So at the end of 2025, P&G launched the Flex Loop project in collaboration with the Linde Group to expand the solvent-based recycling capacity. So solvent-based recycling can be interesting because it theoretically can remove contaminants from the waste stream while preserving the polymer integrity, which ultimately give you access to higher quality recycled content. But interestingly enough, this strategy builds on the company existing capability because expertise in formulation and solvents in this case really became a bridge into advanced recycling technology. So the broader lesson here is really that when regulation reshape the economics of critical inputs, the advantage sit with companies that leverage the internal capability to secure and expand compliant supply rather than waiting around for it to happen. And with that, we can move into the final part of our presentation. And now that we have talked about how the policy compass helps interpret the regulatory direction across key agri-food priority, the next question is really how do you translate this policy signal into strategic priorities for your organization? But before answering that, I like to go back for just one moment to the EPS case. So when the early bans on EPS were established, DART, as we were mentioning, interpreted those as a temporary disruption to manage. So they invested in litigation and lobbying, and when it realized that the bans were there to stay, it was too late, and it found itself misaligned with where the market was headed. But on the other hand, other competitor like Huhtamäki interpreted the bans as structural signal. So it accelerated investment into paper packaging, expanded pulp capacity, and repositioned its product portfolio toward material that were aligned with those emerging circularity mandate. So both companies faced the same regulatory pressure. The difference was that DARF defended its existing asset, while Huhtamäki reallocated early. So the difference really was not information, but how the companies interpret the regulatory signal. So under this light, it's clear that policy is no longer a downstream market compliant issue, it's an upstream innovation signal. So the challenge is to identify where regulation will change the basis for competition. So how should companies set priorities under regulatory shifts? Well, if you think about that, in the agri-food landscape, policy tend to target inputs and products. And because these two items are easily visible from policymaker. But when inputs and product definition change, the manufacturing process also need to adapt to new material or formulation. And that ultimately redefine the whole ecosystem. Supply strategy needs to change, partnership needs to be reevaluated, and demand for products might also change in the market. So how should innovation strategy respond to that? So first, companies needs to identify ingredient, formulation, material or technologies that are likely to become constrained asset and diversify early. Second, portfolios needs to be redesigned around it and ahead of timelines to avoid the compressed deadline and cost premiums. But beyond technical adjustment, this is fundamentally an organizational change. Because R&D teams need to translate regulation direction into reformulation and technologies. CVC and open innovation teams need to identify those emerging technology and partners before they become crowded investment areas. At the same time, marketing teams need to realign product positioning and claims with the evolving regulatory narrative and framing. So companies that succeed are the ones that really understand where regulation are heading, reallocate capital early, and coordinate across the organization. And this is really the difference between reacting to regulatory pressure and converting it into strategic advantage. And this brings us to some final takeaways for our presentation.
Thank you so much, Matilda. So very quickly to recap, I think we touched upon a lot of elements when it comes to policies and how Lux Policy Compass can be put into use. But one of the key takeaways for you to think about is that policy shouldn't be just viewed as a compliance issue. You really have to think about that as a signal of where the market is heading and how you can use our policy compass to help guide that signal path. And secondly, as Matilda pointed out, the companies that are likely to thrive are the ones which are able to read these signals and adjust the innovation priorities and also the capital deployment accordingly. Especially think about the example we brought up, right? DART versus Huhtamäki and how those innovation trajectories are quite different. And last but not the least, I think responding to policy isn't just about fixing a single product. Because of the nature of how product formulation and all of this innovation is taking place, it really requires a coordination across the entire ecosystem. So think about them from ingredients, technologies, all the way going into the partners and your supply chains. And that would help you to stay ahead of the game here. So thank you so much for your attention. And I hope if you have any questions, you can definitely reach out to us.
Yeah, thank you, Matilda, Harini. So now we get to the fun part of the webinar today, where we'll look for questions. So again, to everybody, we'll now take questions. So if you have any questions, please type them into the questions box. And Again, if we don't get to your question today, don't worry. Someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. So with that, let me take a look at what we have coming in. And let's just start in sort of reverse order of the presentation here. Since Matilda kind of wrapped us up, well, we'll start with some packaging type of policy questions. I think the first one here that perhaps is most relevant today is we have material bans, but we see those moving to these more complex integrative frameworks that perhaps place a few more challenges. How does this shift to these type of integrated frameworks change what companies need to focus on as they look for packaging innovation and market access in the future? And perhaps even as we look outside of the EU, how prevalent are these types of frameworks going to be?
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually a very interesting question. So I think that that adds complexity for sure, because if you think about it, under earlier ban, companies could really respond tactically by replacing restricted material. I'm not saying that was an easy job, but it was a straightforward job to do, because you had alternatives you could invest on and start producing them. If you think instead that integrated frameworks, they combine multiple approaches, right? Like recyclability grades, recycled content threshold, EPR obligation, and all of them are integrated into a single set of enforceable condition, making that element of compliance really multidimensional and interdependent. So we're seeing this shift, and we're seeing, as I was also saying during the presentation, that market access is not anymore determined by what type of material is permitted, by whether the packaging system meets the defined performance criteria across its full life cycle. And I think that companies really need to prepare to this new definition of compliance when it comes to packaging, because for sure we're seeing this happening already in Europe, but we are seeing also a lot of other countries following suit. If you think at California, SB 54 tends to follow a similar approach, but also the establishing in Southeast Asia of EPR schemes is a quite strong signal of this, evolution of compliance across the globe. So
where are you seeing these changes? It's big markets, right? California, even though it's just a state, it's a very large market. Clearly, it's also moving into APAC there. So another big, important consumer market for sure as we think about these things. And I think the important word you said there was life cycle. If you're not innovating with life cycle in mind, it sounds like moving forward, you're going to get stuck somewhere within these frameworks. And so it's really critical to think about that. Yeah, this is a great perspective, Matilda. So kind of stepping back out, coming back to Harini and some of the interesting points she brought up early on. I think maybe the question we'll select and tackle here, maybe even to close us out. Let's go impact here. Which technology areas should companies prioritize now, right? Matilda just brought up some of these clear challenges, right? We have frameworks, we have a lot of other, there are some tit for tat policies out there that you still need to be concerned about. So if you're a company and you're thinking about innovating here through policy, you as somebody who really thinks broadly about agri-food and health, what should that innovation pipeline be focused on as it can impact these shifting policy trends ahead?
Yeah, that's an exciting question, to be honest. Like everybody thinks about policies maybe constraining innovation in some ways, but honestly, I think there are ways in which you can think about catalyzing tech innovation opportunities. So I think from the analysis that we did and the report and the signals that we, were able to capture, definitely say that the priority kind of like for technology would go from upstream all the way to downstream. Now, the upstream part I already brought up. I think sourcing is going to be a big deal. And I think it's just moving beyond just like sourcing certification. You're really talking about alternative sourcing, or even with the current system, what can you do better to be able to, fit into the evolving policy changes? The EU NGT is a great example. So you may have to think about, if you've not already, building a kind of a portfolio of these technologies, right? Whether it's about the next generation breeding, not just in Europe, but also across the globe. I think that's going to be an important one. And then as you go a little bit into the ingredient formulation side of things, the whole idea about how agile you have to be. Policies are changing, additives are going away. Titanium dioxide was one example, but we're going to see more of these. How can you expedite that reformulation to make sure that you are ahead of the game? I think that's a set of technologies, whether it's focused on AI-driven product formulation or platform technologies, which could really bring in different types of data silos. I think that's also going to be an exciting one to invest in. And last but not the least, I think a combination of like this growing bioeconomy. And again, it's been pretty difficult to monetize the bioeconomy, but I'm already seeing signals in different ways, right? It's not just going to be only fermentation. It's going to be a suite of technologies where you have to think about enzymes, fermentation, strain engineering, expediting that part. I think so with what's happening in Korea, China, but also across US, right? I think that's an interesting one for bioeconomy scale up. So I think you can't invest everywhere, but I think you got to think about prioritizing where policy support is going to be there and where commercial relevance is going to start taking place, right? That's the important one you have to look at.
So we have a couple areas then, sounds like, where you could invest. Each of those doesn't necessarily sound simple, right? You may have to partner in areas where you don't have expertise, so you really need to think about your capabilities and then position them within that. And I think that's maybe an important point to leave us with. While we can always look at the broader picture, it's very important to sit down with our analysts like Matilda Harini and have perhaps a more pointed discussion to say, here's my capabilities, here's where we're at today, where do we position these on the market? Because as you said, it's perhaps getting some guardrails, but not getting less complicated, right? To manage these policies and work through them, but becoming very important. And the great thing is, I think the signals are becoming stronger, that perhaps some similarities are happening in the world. So you might be able to begin to pick and choose as this happens in a couple key markets in the world and move forward. So with that, let's close there. And again, if you have questions, we'll get to them. So thanks, Harini. Thanks, Matilda. That's going to conclude the webinar for today. Again, for those who listened in, all the slides will be available to you. You'll get an email after this event today. And of course, we always ask you, after you leave the webinar, we're going to have you asked to complete a survey. That survey helps us think about and decide as kind of a think tank here what webinars to write in the future that are impactful to you. So please do fill that out. And then of course, check out any upcoming webinars we may have on the member site and the website. So thanks for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.